Web 2.0.
Innovation.
Trend.
Collaboration.
Software.
Metadata.
Got the world turning as fast as it can? Hear how technology can help, legally speaking, with two of the top legal technology experts, authors, and lawyers, Dennis Kennedy and Tom Mile. Welcome to the Kennedy Mile Report here on the Legal Talk Network.
And welcome to episode 271 of the Kennedy Mile Report. I'm Dennis Kennedy in Ann Arbor.
And I'm Tom Mile in Dallas. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsors.
First of all, we'd like to thank Colonial Surety Company Bonds and Insurance for bringing you this podcast. Whatever court bond you need, get a quote and purchase online at colonialsurety.com/podcast.
And we'd also like to thank ServeNow, a nationwide network of trusted pre-screened process servers. Work with the most professional process servers who have experience with high-volume serves, embrace technology, and understand the litigation process. Visit servenow.com to learn more.
And we want to mention that the second edition of our book, The Lawyer's Guide to Collaboration Tools and Technologies, is available on Amazon. Everyone agrees that collaboration is essential in today's world, but now, more than ever before, knowing the right tools will make all the difference. As I like to say at the start of all our 2020 podcasts, what a difference another week or two makes. And the unexpected just keeps rolling on. In our last episode, we discussed the opportunities presented by low-code, no-code approaches to app development. In this episode, we're excited to be interviewing another very special guest as part of our goal of adding regular interview shows to the podcast. Tom, what's all on our agenda for this episode?
Well, Dennis, in this edition of the Kennedy Mile Report, we are thrilled to have as our guest Bob Moesta, President and CEO of the Rewired Group and author of a brand new book, Demand Side Sales. And as usual, we're going to finish up with our parting shots, that one tip, website, or observation that you can start to use the second that this podcast is over. But first up, we are so pleased to have and to welcome Bob Moesta, who describes himself as a founder, maker, innovator, speaker, and now a professor. Not a lot of things there. Maybe most important for fans of this show, Bob is the pioneer of the jobs to be done theory, something that if you listen to us enough, we talk about in this podcast nearly every other episode. Bob's brand new book, Demand Side Sales, brings what we think is a really fresh and practical approach to probably the least favorite topic for many in the legal profession, which is selling. Bob, we want to welcome you to the Kennedy Mile Report.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Dennis. Great to be here.
So, Bob, from the way that you introduce your book, I think you also originally came to the idea of selling from, I guess I would call a somewhat negative perspective. How did that perspective change, and what maybe led you to write this book?
Well, so first of all, I'm an engineer, so I actually hate to sell more than lawyers, right? so I totally get it. But from my perspective, my second startup, I actually took a role as head of sales and marketing, and taking a very engineering approach to it. I built a process and, kind of figured out the features and benefits, and I got the basics down. And then I went and started to pitch, and I started to, I pitched Home Depot, and I ended up pitching Lowe's and these different, but it felt like I was just spouting things at people. And like at some point I had to sell everybody all the time, everything. And so this whole aspect, it made me just feel, the only word I could come up with was icky. It was that pit in my stomach going like, okay, when do I turn off? When do I stop selling? When do I and then at some point in time, I had a very good colleague who basically said, look, stop. You're psyching yourself out here. What you need to do is help people buy. And I'm like, oh. And so the moment that I kind of made that flip to what I call the demand side, I started to actually realize it's about helping people make progress and how does my product fit into their lives. And so that's basically the premise of the book, is that we, the subtitle, if you will, is Stop Selling and Start Helping Your Customers Make Progress. And so it's this aspect of understanding, where do they want to go? What do they want to do? And how does your product or service help them make that progress?
Well, yeah, I think you started to talk about it there, but let's maybe pull that apart a little bit more just to get the lay of the land for this discussion. We probably need to talk about the differences between and the distinction between supply side and demand side selling. Kind of what I think the difference may be obvious to some lawyers, but for those who think that sales is a skill to be learned, it may not be so obvious.
Right. So I grew up on what I call the supply side, which is I work for a company and we produce a product, and we then would look at and say, who wants to buy this product? And everything goes through this primary kernel, this primary, key of the product or the service and like who needs it. So, I make mattresses. So who needs a mattress, and how many mattresses can I sell? And everything goes from a mechanical side, from the supply side. But what you realize is when you flip over to the demand side, which is, why do I buy a mattress? When do I buy a mattress? What causes me to say, today's the day I need a new mattress? You start to realize that the supply side actually doesn't even ask those questions. And so you start to realize it's like, when I'm sleeping in the Barca lounger, when I'm actually taking, how many bottles of ZzzQuil do you have before you realize, maybe I need a new mattress, right? There's all these other things, and it's about sleep and rest. It's not about a mattress. And so what you start to realize is there's context and there's outcome that people have when they want a new mattress. But most of the time we're talking about a language of, hybrid and springs and foam and all these features that actually mean nothing to basically the average consumer. And so part of this is the demand side is really looking through the customer's eyes, hearing what they hear, feel what they feel, see what they see, and then understand what's meaningful to them as the outcomes they're seeking, not the product they're seeking.
So, Bob, this is Dennis, and I told you before the show, I've been a fan for a long time, and I looked back in some of your early podcasts, 2013, where you kind of went through jobs to be done, and your interviewing technique of buyers were really influential on me. So, to go back to what you're saying there with the mattresses, kind of interesting to me, because you talk about we're not buying the mattress, or in the case of legal, the services. We're trying to make some progress in our life. And if you come from the product side, like if you're a mattress store, you're going, well, people need a new mattress. I'm going like, the last thing I want to do is buy a mattress. If I could get like a white noise machine, there's like a whole bunch of other things I would do because I'm focused on sleep. So could you kind of dive into like what you do, this notion of you're hiring your product or service to make progress in your life? Yeah.
So the fundamental premise is that people don't buy things, they hire them to make progress in their life. And part of it is that and it's caused, it's not random. There is actually no such thing as a random or an impulse purchase. When you start to dig, so the first thing is I actually back in the 90s got trained in criminal and intelligence interrogation, and I learned how basically how people lie to themselves about why they buy things. Oh, I bought this because I got a deal. Like I bought this car because I got a deal. No, you bought a car for a whole host of reasons, and it's not just the fact that you got a deal. And so part of it is to understand what's the process you go through. How do you actually come to the conclusion, and how do you decide today's the day I need a new mattress, or I need to write a will, right? Or I need to, there are certain things certain dominoes that have to fall in people's lives for them to realize they need a lawyer. Right. And so part of this is to look past what they bought, but to get down to why they bought it. And what it is people will say, well, they have a problem, right? Well, it's kind of a problem, but it's also an outcome. What I say is it's the context and outcome together that describe the progress they're trying to make. And so ultimately, and a lot of times we don't actually have language for it. So we reflect what we're trying to do through the product or a feature, right? Like I want a simple will. Well, why simple? Is simple because you don't want to spend money, or simple because it's the people who have to understand it, or I don't have a bunch of stuff. Like what's the simple mean? And so it's this notion of taking those words and unpacking what people mean by stuff and the intent behind it, and whether it's pushing them or pulling them. And so it's that whole aspect of listening to not only what people say, but how they say it.
So coming back, you mentioned that nothing's random. There's a cause for everything. I think you talk a lot in the book about the difference between correlation, which really is kind of the bedrock of marketing, and causation, which I think you say is much more important. In fact, the term that you use is that causation is the night vision goggles, which was really resonated with me because I'm thinking that's incredibly powerful. Can you but I'm not sure I totally understand the difference between correlation and causation. Can you maybe go into that a little bit?
So the thing is, I'm 55 years old. I live in 48236. I have a certain income. I'm in a certain profession, but that doesn't cause me to buy the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. It's not what causes me to do it. And so what happens is we have demographics, we have psychographics, and a lot of people say, well, we know our customers really well. And then my question is so then what causes them today to say today's the day I need a will, or I need a new mattress? And what you realize is they can't answer it. And what you start to realize is we end up creating differentiation of, well, I'm an Xer, I'm on the edge of a boomer Xer, right? But I'm not a Gen Z, right? And it's like, well, I do things differently. I want to buy a mattress differently. But the reality is we actually struggle with the same things. And so part of this is you start to realize that when you get down to causality, like the dominoes of, I don't have much time. I don't know what to do with my old mattress. The fact is like, I have these kinds of problems with it, like very specific. It doesn't matter who I am. It's more about the context I'm in. And that's what actually drives me to purchase or to buy, because I'm in that context with a desired outcome. So correlation is one of those things where, so I had an internship when I was 18 years old with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Deming, and he was 85 at the time, and he's hard of hearing, but I didn't realize this at 18, that when he screams at you, he can't hear. So he's not really screaming at me, but I thought he was. And so he'd always say, like, don't ever confuse correlation and causation. They're very fundamentally different. And what causes somebody to do something is like the bedrock of what we want to actually understand. And so that was almost like I felt beat into me by some of my mentors.
And so it sounds like if we're focusing on causation, if causation is really where you can get to what you need from the customer, from the client, it's a personalized process, right? I mean, it's not something you can just go to them and say, I've got this for you to think about, because I really need to learn more about them before I can propose what my service or product needs to look like, right?
That's right. That's right. So I've used most of this method and tools for almost 30 years on developing and launching new products. I've done about 3,500 different new products. And the thing is that what I started to realize is the struggling moment in most businesses is sales. And so how do we go help people sell? And what you start to realize is we don't teach sales at business schools. Like like 10 years ago, Clay and I are sitting around Clay Christensen at the Harvard Business School as a colleague, and he helped me co-architect the jobs to be done theory. And we basically sat there and go, like, why are there no sales professors? When you talk to anybody in business, and having done 7 startups myself, I realized, like, holy crap, like, it's the hardest thing of all. So why aren't they teaching sales at any of the business schools? And you start to realize it's like, well, it's all technique. It's all about product. It's all about, and so part of this is to say, well, what are those foundational pieces we need to have? Because at some point in time, it's not really an art. It can be a science. And if we understand the causation behind it and the trade-offs that people make to get it, you start to realize it's actually really, it's much easier to both market and sell if you understand the progress they're trying to make.
I was thinking that many years ago, I used to do estate planning, and the one thing that I ended up calling it a triggering event, but if people were going to sign their wills, to actually sign them, typically the triggering event was both parents getting on the plane at the same time. Yep. And almost immediately brought people in. It was almost like you could say, if I had a relationship with travel agents, I could probably get more wills done, because this was the actual point. But the one thing I wanted to go back to is this notion of helping. So instead of selling you're helping. And I love the notion of concierge. And so I was in the buying mode yesterday because I had a broken blender. So the why is, in some ways fairly straightforward, but there's also a lot of complexity. But I realized I just really kind of wanted to have somebody kind of talk me through the options and help me pick the right one instead of figuring it out myself.
And this is an important point, is that, like, if you're just going to go buy the exact same blender you had before, that's just, I call that restocking. That's not actually kind of buying in my case, because I'm trying to say, when people stop using one thing and start to use another. So the moment that your blender broke and you basically made the choice to say, I'm not going to just go, because the easiest thing is to just go buy what you had. But the reality is, the moment you say, well, maybe I have to have something different, that is the struggling moment of it breaking and deciding not to take the same old thing. That's when all of a sudden this whole process unfolds in front of you. Like, where do you go? How do you decide? What research do you do? What language do you use? What do they talk about blenders for? What are you going to use the blender for? Like, it just starts to come, right? And so part of this is there's an underlying aspect of my current one doesn't work, right? I have a certain place where I store it, right? So I either have to throw the old one out. But did you actually try to fix the old one?
No, I didn't want to. I didn't want to do that, and I also knew I wanted to, in some sense, upgrade, for a couple of reasons. One is that my wife thinks the old one is way too loud.
Too loud? What do you mean too loud?
What I mean is that when I do a breakfast smoothie, she has to put her fingers in her ears.
And do you not make a breakfast smoothie when she's sleeping in?
I'm very careful to make sure the bedroom door is closed and take extra precautions.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then so this is part of the thing of why you don't want to replace it. It's too loud, right? What else?
Right.
What else was wrong with the old thing?
It wouldn't. I wanted something. I believed I wanted something that was more powerful because I didn't think this smaller one kind of blended up everything that I threw into my smoothie.
So this is a perfect example. So you're already talking about the product, and what I want to do is I don't want to say, okay, how powerful do you want to say? Like, what does power get you? What can't you do because you don't have power?
I can't actually, my wife and I were talking about this yesterday. She said, why don't you put vegetables into your smoothies? I said, well, this one, the one I had I feel it's underpowered and would leave things kind of stringy and wouldn't get them all blended up in the way that I want.
Got it. And so had you tried that before?
Yeah, there are a number of things that I like to put into my smoothies that I just didn't feel it got all,
So there's things that you want to add to your smoothie that you don't feel you can because then you can't drink it.
Right.
Got it. Okay. So this is a perfect example of unpacking from powerful and saying like, all right, we got to make the most powerful thing to understanding why I want it powerful. What is it actually supposed to do? Because in some cases, that's actually more about the blades and the blade design than it is actually about the amperage of the unit, right? And so what else? What else were you, as you started to look, what else did you see? What else did you start to, where did your eyes go?
I talked to my friend who's like the blender master who always goes top of line stuff, and I said, should I go to like the top of the line stuff, or should I back off from that, and what are the reasons? So he told me like what the trade-offs were, which didn't seem like much of a trade-off. So I was able to go to a much lower price point.
What were the trade-offs?
Well, it does come back to this notion of power, and so when you talk about the language of the product seller, everything is watts, and you're like, so I went to Target yesterday and I go like, I have no idea the difference between 900 watt, 1,000 watt, 1,100 watt, 1,200 watt. Like, it has no meaning to me.
More has got to be better
to a point, unless it's louder, right?
Right. See. So this is exactly the point, right? So at some point in time, there's trade-offs that you have to make, and it's like, I want it really powerful, but I don't want it to wake everyone. I want it to be too loud, so I don't wake people up, and I don't have my wife putting her fingers in her ears, right?
Right.
So the aspect here is that So in the book, I talk about this process, and there's first thought, there's passive looking, where you're going through your day and you're kind of like seeing things, but now you have a space in the brain to go like, well, maybe I should think about blenders. And now there's a blender ad on TV and you see it, where before it was playing, but you actually never saw it, right? And then there's this active looking where you think about, well, I need power. I want to put more vegetables in it. I want it to be quiet. Everything is really kind of single, orthogonal, independent things. And then comes deciding. And deciding is actually about managing trade-offs. And at some point when you can't connect the dots of, does this 1,100 watt blender, which will pulverize my vegetables so they're smooth enough I can drink them, but will it be too loud, right? And then, is it really overplayed? Do I need that much power? And is the bigger motor too big that I can't store it? Or at what point, how much more money is the 1,100 versus the 1,000? And so you start to actually make these trade-offs between it. And you start to realize that the trade-offs sometimes are about power, but it's multidimensional. And so understanding what is more important than other things as you're looking at buying this thing is like, okay. And what about price? Where was price in all this?
So price wasn't that much of a factor. I mean, we went to Target. There was one that was a candidate that was $20 off. But I would say when it came right down to it, between the two I was looking at, it was the fact that the one that I bought had 2 cups that you could put your smoothies into, in addition to like the bigger blender piece. And so it had the extra cup which I'd say. And then the bigger blender made it attractive to my wife, who was with me, because then she could make salsa and soups and stuff like that.
So some other things.
She would become more engaged in the device.
And so all of a sudden, in some cases, you're willing to pay more for something that actually has now a little bit more versatility. So now it's just not about power, and it's not about the stringy vegetables. It's now about other things and applications. And so this is where we start to realize, as simple as buying a blender is, the thing is most people just know, like, well, what's the volume? What's the number of cups? How many, they'll put these things out there. But they have to understand, as people are trying to upgrade, what are those things and what are the reference points to say, what's the next thing? And so part of this is like, how does somebody decide to say, I have a will, but it's time to update the will. Like, what are the 4 or 5 different things that make it today's the day we have to update the will versus we have to make a will, which is different, right?
That goes to your notion of struggling moment, but I looked at my own will and my dad's will the other day. Yeah. And I think it plays into the struggling moment, because I needed to get in my head what was there because of COVID times, and my daughter asking me a while back, like, what was going to happen. And I looked at it and I said, it's not exactly right now, but it's close enough.
It's good enough.
Yeah. And it's kind of a hassle to go to a lawyer, so the typical things people have in a lawyer, and you're thinking, do I really want to spend, like $3,000 to make a small change, when, as humans are, when it comes to estate planning, our plan is we're going to be immortal anyway, right? So it doesn't matter.
Well, so this brings up a really good example. So when one of the things I did is I built 1,000 homes here in Detroit. Mostly for first-time home buyers, divorced family with kids, and then downsizers. Think of like your parents, right? And what causes them to move, right? And one of the things we found was this very awkward discussion when a friend of theirs either got very sick or passed away, and that they would literally go like, oh my gosh, like, we need to move before, we can't do this together. I don't want to have to move without you, and you don't want to move without me, and we really need to do this, right? And so one of the things I found is one of the underlying causal mechanisms is that when one of their friends had passed, or one of their friends' spouses had passed, they looked through the obituaries every single day. And so I moved my advertising from the real estate section and talking about basically my 1,554 square foot, 2-bedroom, 2.5 bath, first floor laundry ranch condo, to saying, in the obituaries, I said, like, time to move, need help figuring it out? Give me a call. 37% increase in my traffic, right? So it's this crazy thing where if you understand cause, there's no correlation involved in it. That's causation. When these things happen, you now start to figure out when you need to be in front of them, as opposed to by the time they're raising their hand to buy a house, they already got it all down. Right. And so part of this is there's this early part of creating the space and educating themselves about what to do, like the blender, that's where you want to be. And so part of this is understanding how people do that and why people do that, not just the product or service they're buying.
So before we go to take a break for our next segment, you started talking about the 6 steps, but we didn't get all the way through them. So we got to first thought, passive looking, active looking, and deciding. But there's 2 more. There's onboarding and ongoing use. So I want to ask a specific question about those. Using Dennis's example here, I would say you would characterize buying the blender as the big hire, right?
That's correct.
But then there's a bunch of little hires that are probably more important than the big hire. Can you kind of give us an idea of what that means?
The way to think about it is the big hire is buying the bottle of Windex, and the little hire is spraying the bottle of Windex. Like, where do you spray it, and where does it work, and where do you know it's going to work, and where you're not sure it's going to work, but you're going to try, right? And so part of this is that those expectations of what the blender is supposed to be doing and how well it works is set at the big hire. But the progress is actually made when he starts using the blender, right? And so he made a smoothie this morning, right? So how loud was it?
It was not bad, but my wife was at the dentist, so we haven't done the acid test yet.
That's right. But at some point in time, it's quite. So here's the other part. The reference point of better is the old one. It's not all the 5 in the store, right? And so that's the first part. The second part is to actually understand that though he wanted the right power and the right these other pieces, what happens is that because he had to make trade-offs, and oh, by the way, did you get the one that had the $20 off or not?
I got the one that was $20 off. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, because again, people think that's the reason, and it's more like I want to feel like I got more for less, and it's literally just a psychological trick at the end of the day. But
Right.
But the reality is, like, the little hires is every smoothie that he makes, and then at some point in time there becomes a new struggling moment about the smoothie. So he's got three, the big vessel, and then he's got two smaller vessels that he can actually drink the smoothies in. But now where do you store all that stuff? Right. And because the last one didn't have it, and I'm just kind of assuming your kitchen doesn't have like extra rooms. If it's like mine, it's a Rubik's Cube where you got to put everything in the exact right way to make sure it all fits. Right. And so part of it is there's new struggling moments. And so the second half of this and the little hires is that when you start to use it, it's every innovation, every solution basically takes care of one set of struggling moments, but usually then creates a new set of struggling moments. And so part of it is that it's this kind of domino effect that happens. And so you have to be able to understand what are the new struggling moments around the blender, that now that he's got the noise problem solved and he's got the grittiness problem solved, there's now going to be some new struggles. What are they? And that's the second half of the sale to me, which is how do we actually improve the product, or give them suggestions, or give them new recipes for salsa, or how do we actually help them with those other things? Though, because his wife talked about salsa, but has she ever made it before? Does she really want to do that? Like, where does she find a recipe for it, etc.?
Which ties very nicely into talking about how this applies to legal services, which we are going to explore in our next segment. But before we get there, let's take a quick break for a message from our sponsors, and then we'll be back with Bob.
Looking for a process server you can trust? ServeNow.com is a nationwide network of local, pre-screened process servers. ServeNow works with the most professional process servers in the industry, connecting your firm with process servers who embrace technology, have experience with high-volume serves, and understand the litigation process and rules of properly effectuating service. Find a pre-screened process server today. Visit www.servenow.com.
Wish you could get a quote and purchase an appeal, trustee, estate, or any other court or fiduciary bond quickly online? Colonial Surety Company has every bond you need and is a direct insurer that's U.S. Treasury listed, licensed in all 50 states and territories, and rated A Excellent by AM Best. So you can be confident it's a trusted resource. Get started at colonialsurety.com/podcast. And now let's get back to the Kennedy Mile Report. I'm Tom Mile.
And I'm Dennis Kennedy. And we are joined by our special guest, Bob Moesta, President and CEO of the Rewired Group and author of the new book, the great new book, Demand Side Sales. Bob, let's turn to the legal profession in the potential role of demand selling. I actually see tons of potential here. I mean, your example in the book of the business CEO who had to switch banks struck me as being extremely applicable in legal services, especially a couple of things, but one is how easy it seems to be that if you pay attention, you can keep existing clients because they really don't want to change because it's difficult. Do you want to tell that story and maybe some of the lessons you drew from it?
Yeah. So part of this is that most people say, like, there's really no emotion in banking. Like, if you talk to people about banking, it's like, well, they take my deposits, I pay out checks, they run my payroll. Like, there's things that they do, right? And so most people have no real emotion about it. But when you talk about people who switch banks, it's nothing but emotion, right? And so when you start to interview people and say, what caused you to say today's the day that you're going to switch banks? They're just wonderful stories. Like, what causes somebody to say, today's the day I'm switching lawyers, right? It's not the same reason of like, what caused you to say, I have to get a lawyer. They're different, right? And so what you start to realize is, in most cases, there's the familiarity of the current bank, for example, in this guy's case, is that they helped him build the business and get to a certain point, but he was now getting to a point where he was trying to pivot and take the business from like 20 million to 100 million, right? And as he starts to think about it, he doesn't want to share that with the bank, because at some point the bank has basically agreed to the loan set, or the set of loans that they had, that were under certain premises. And as he's playing this out, the fact is he's starting to realize, like, if he plays this to the bank actually can hinder him, because at some point they won't either give him the money, or the fact is that they could think about basically changing the terms on the account. And so as he starts to do it, and they become more and more critical of the cash flow and how he's running it, because he's actually doubling down and investing in it. And so all of a sudden there's this notion where it's like I don't know if I can actually trust my bank. And nobody, in some cases, none of this is explicit, but you can start to see the fact is that all of a sudden there's another bank account that's open, and all of a sudden things are happening from a different bank. And then all of a sudden it's like, all right. And what they did is they figured out a way in which to like go shop it to other people. And they actually never gave a chance to the current bank to even look at the loan, because at some point they felt like they were, in some cases, too conservative, or the process they put them through in the first time, they would never buy into what they wanted to do the next time. And so part of it is that they pigeonholed themselves, and they didn't actually understand the progress that business owner, that CEO, is trying to do. And so part of it is by actually figuring out how you can help them make progress, as opposed to sell your money, sell your loans, sell your services, and only fit into your thing. Because at some point in time, if it's not going to work for you, you're better off actually sending them somewhere else, because they're going to go there anyway. And so part of this is when you flip the lens and figure out how to help people make progress, you actually start to realize, like, at some point, like I wasn't a builder. I was actually a mover. I helped people move from one home to another. And when I actually thought about myself as that business, I stopped thinking about all the features I had to add to my houses, and the features I had to actually add to the entire experience, which is including moving as part of, when you bought a house from us, we included moving and 2 years of storage, right? We actually included all these different things that actually help people make the house feel like a home. And so all of a sudden you start to realize, like, it was all those little things that were actually way easier to do than actually making very, very unique houses. So I think that's the point.
I think one of the things that resonates with me about that story is really when the new banks came in to pitch their business, that two of the banks were immediately excluded, where two of them sort of hit the nail on the head. Can you kind of talk about the differences in approach that got to that point?
Yes. And this actually comes true in a lot of cases, where you start to realize is the first thing is so 4 banks came in. 2 banks literally walked in and said, look, this is who we are. This is what we do. This is, who we work with. This is how much money we have. We can do this for you. And just basically said, here's the menu of things to pick from us, right? But 2 other banks basically came in and said, like, we need to understand your business. What are you trying to do? Where are you trying to go? Why are you not doing this? Why are you doing that? And in some cases, stress testing to understand the business. And the CEO was like, I had 2 people who really cared about my business, or at least cared enough to ask questions about it, as opposed to lump me in with a biotech firm or with an engineering company, or most people just put us in the wrong spot because they don't take time to learn from us. The second thing, though, was you started to hear things like, well, they were curious about the business and they gave me options. What's interesting is in the process of how people buy is options actually help them understand what they want. And when you don't give options, it's either us or nothing. People will literally go find options so they can actually bounce it against it, so they can make those trade-offs. And so these 2 companies came back and started to offer options and basically do different things to help them get involved. But the bigger part was you started to realize, so how'd you pick this one? Well, I could trust this person. I'm like, okay, you've been with this previous bank for 15 years, and now you're with this. You've met somebody 3 times, and you trust them. What happened to cause trust? And they could literally state it right straight out. Like, one is they listened about my business. They gave me options. At some point in time, they were responsive, but not too responsive. I said, what does that mean? They're like, well, they're not sitting around waiting for me. Right. And it's like, at some point they got back to me within a reasonable amount of time. They always had an answer that was there. And ultimately they said no to me on something. I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, well, I wanted to push the limits on something, and 2 or 3 things. And they said, well, no, if that's what you want to do, then we're not the bank for you. And the moment that they could tell me no, I knew they were my bank. And I'm like, wow. And it turns out that they paid a higher rate and a higher closing rate than anything anywhere else. But they knew that they could trust these people to actually help them grow the business.
It's a trade-off, yep.
And they're willing to pay for it. That's the other part is most people don't realize like everybody takes the lowest loan. Everybody's trying to, of course, everybody wants the $20 off. They're like, if you're going to offer 20, I'll take it. Right. But at the same time, the fact is if I can't tell the difference between this one and that one and I get $20 off, I'll take it every time. It's like mom and apple pie. But that's not why you buy.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was in-house counsel at MasterCard for a good number of years, and so much of what you were just saying and in the bank example just resonates with that. You know, like the law firms that come in and they tell you what they think you need and what their legal services, how they fit the MasterCard business, and they fundamentally misdescribe the MasterCard business. I mean, like they just show that they don't understand it to the point where you go, I'm never going to hire them for anything. And then there are these small things that add up, like over the 15 years. You know, like it's almost like they're microaggressions. You know, you didn't return the call on time. I told them I only wanted to spend $10,000, and they ran up a $50,000 bill. Right. Those kinds of things. So I was just kind of curious what you've seen, if anything, in the legal profession that you might want to share with our audience.
So I think I always have weird analogies, but like, so one of them to me is like, if you think of Casper, which is the mattress maker, right? They basically have come out of nowhere and in less than 5 years built $1 billion mattress company. $1 billion, right? And they have no showrooms, right? They have, and for the most part, everything was done online. They're now moving where they have some stuff at some larger retail stores, but for the most part, it's all been online. And the reality is that at some point in time, they knew how bad it was to buy a mattress, to walk into an empty store with one person in it and 40 mattresses and go like, okay, we're going to pick one. I was like, I don't know if I really need it. I don't know like how to pick. I don't know what and eventually people just end up buying the one they can afford, the best one they can afford. But, Casper is asking questions like, do you stick your leg out at night? Right? Like, why is that relevant? Well, it turns out that you're probably hot. So when you stick your leg out, you're actually trying to cool off. So that means you actually probably need some cooling in the mattress. And so they can ask you questions because they understand the detailed causality of what causes you to do it. So here's the thing is that my belief is that for the most part, complicated law is, for most lawyers, I would think the fun law, right? It's at the high end of the market, right? But this low end of the market where you've got people who can actually learn on their own or basically do things on their own. The fact is like LegalZoom, right? Those kinds of aspects. The problem is that they're actually not helping people make progress as much as they want. And so part of this is actually realizing what does that low end really look like and how do you actually change your business model to actually service a little of that low end? Because at some point in time, if you make mattresses, the fact is now most mattress companies are making mattresses in a bed or mattresses in a box and shipping. And so my aspect is what are the things that who are people who want to actually use a lawyer, but actually don't even know how to engage? We call that non-consumption. Where do people want a new mattress, but they really don't know how to buy a mattress? And so you start to realize that most people wait way too long to buy a mattress. My belief is people wait way too long to get a lawyer because they only think they need a lawyer when they're in trouble. And they don't think of lawyers as somebody who to prevent trouble or to actually organize the things before trouble happens.
There's a stat out there in the legal profession that 80% of the people who need to use lawyers, and we'll say need to use lawyers, can't afford them. But I think that, as you just mentioned, I think a large percentage of that is people who don't know how or when to engage lawyers.
That's right. And what I would say is the majority, and this is just my experience, is most lawyers treat me like I'm a 10-year-old. Right. And they try to explain, I'm a pretty sophisticated businessman. I've done a lot of different things. And the reality is like they take my time so much. They don't adjust their conversation to who I am. They just have a standard way of doing it. So I now have a lawyer that I've had for probably 7 or 8 years, but I probably would go through a new lawyer almost through every contract because it was just so painful. And so you start to realize like at some point I need a lawyer, but the reality is like I need somebody who's who actually understands my business and understands what progress I'm trying to make. And that though I probably need a 47-page document, 2 pages is enough to get started. And then this is how we're going to proceed. And so the aspect is how you actually understand the progress I want to make is more important than the fact is what is the correct legal response over the entire point in time versus like, I just want to get started. And so it's a very interesting thing where I think that there's a lot of things where people should use a lawyer. They actually have a thought about a lawyer, but they actually don't know what to do with it.
And with that, we're out of time. So I think there's a whole access to justice question there that we might want to invite Bob back for another hour to talk about. But before we head on to the end, Bob, we want to thank you so much for being on the podcast. Can you let our audience know where people can buy your book, where they can learn more about you, get in contact with you if you want?
As everything, it's on Amazon, and it's under Demand Side Sales 101, and it's just the framework on helping stop selling and helping people make progress. It's hardcover, softcover, Kindle, and will be Audible by the end of October. You can find me on LinkedIn, Bob Moesta, Moesta. You can go to bobmoesta.com, or you can go to the Rewired Group, is the small design firm that I use or that I run, where we develop products and help people build new markets.
So thank you so much, Bob. It was great. Now it's time for our parting shots. That one tip, website, or observation you can use the second this podcast ends. Bob, you want to start us off?
Yeah. So I was talking with Clay about 5 or 6 years ago, and he talked about what was my greatest innovation. And I'm like, I have no idea. Like, I don't think that way. He goes, yeah, but no, I got a context for you. You're dead. You're on the pearly gates, and there's a list. What's on the top of the list that's going to get you into heaven? I'm like, oh, wow, that's hard. And so first thing I'm like, well, the Patriot missile guidance system, it was amazing and it's great, but like, I'm not sure that's going to get me into heaven. And I worked on Pokemon mac and cheese, and that's really delicious, but I don't think that's good enough to get me into heaven. And I kind of searched around, and it all kind of went back in 1987 to 1992. I worked for Ford Motor Company, and one of the struggling moments that I conquered was I basically, every time I'd rent a car, I wouldn't actually know which side of the car the gas tank filler cap was on. And so I actually helped build or design the arrow on the gas tank. And so half the people are like, oh my gosh, I know what you're talking about. The other half are like when you go to look at your gas gauge, there's a little triangle that points you to the side that the filler cap is on. And that is where you basically know where to pull up for your car, so you don't have to remember it.
And that is officially the best parting shot we have ever had on the show, because I use that arrow constantly, and it's just amazing. All right, so my parting shot very quickly is an update for our listeners on how I am using the ReadWise app as part of my Second Brain project, and I'm going to use it as talk about it in terms of this discussion. I bought Bob's book last week. I read it. I was highlighting. I was taking notes. Because it was connected to ReadWise, all I had to do was open up. I'm keeping my notes now in Notion. I just had to open up Notion. All of my highlights, all of my notes had been automatically synced over there. I didn't have to worry about the stuff I wasn't taking notes on. It was all there ready for me to then further highlight, to further summarize, to really drill down on what we wanted to talk to Bob about during the podcast. It was so simple and easy. It was automatic. I cannot recommend ReadWise enough as a note-taking and progressive summarization tool, and I've gone to the $9 a month subscription price to have it. I think it's a fantastic tool. We'll listen for it more on future podcasts.
Wow. So I'm a little bit of self-promotion today. So I've put up my new Mighty Network site called the Kennedy Idea Propulsion Laboratory Community. And as part of that, I've created a new online course about personal quarterly offsites, which we have discussed on this podcast before, which basically you take some time to yourself. I just do a half a day at the end of each quarter and spend some time on the important but not urgent category. And so I just did that and kind of set out my priorities for the rest of the year and came up with a really cool technique that I'm going to try to eliminate all these little tiny things that are always nagging me and on my list from time to time, and just see if I can knock out one of them a day, as long as it takes 15 minutes to 45 minutes.
And so that wraps it up for this edition of the Kennedy Mile Report. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. You can find show notes for this episode on the Legal Talk Network's page for this podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to our podcast in iTunes or on the Legal Talk Network site, where you can find archives of all of our previous podcasts along with transcripts. If you'd like to get in touch with us, remember you can reach out to us on LinkedIn, or remember we love to get voicemail for our second segment. So that voicemail number is 720-441-6820. So until the next podcast, I'm Tom Mile.
And I'm Dennis Kennedy, and you've been listening to the Kennedy Mile Report, a podcast on legal technology with an internet focus. If you like what you heard today, please rate us in Apple Podcasts, and we'll see you next time for another episode of the Kennedy Mile Report on the Legal Talk Network.
Thanks for listening to the Kennedy Mile Report. Check out Dennis and Tom's book, The Lawyer's Guide to Collaboration Tools and Technologies, Smart Ways to Work Together, from ABA Books or Amazon. And join us every other week for another edition of the Kennedy Mile Report, only on the Legal Talk Network.